Very excited to play because the show yesterday was crazy. The people were just like, definitely, you could feel the energy in the room. All the emotions were like just boiling. I loved it, and I just want to play every day, really.
In 2018, Tomas Lindberg stepped back onto the stage with At the Gates, and it felt like a storm had just been unleashed. For years, the band had been legends in melodic death metal, but now they were proving they could still set the standard. Lindberg's voice had always been raw, like broken glass carried by fire, and in 2018 he sharpened it even further. Fans were not just watching a frontman, they were watching a survivor who had carried the weight of an entire genre on his shoulders. The growls, the shouts, the intensity, none of it had faded. Instead, it had matured into something more powerful. Lindberg wasn't simply performing songs from the past. He was rewriting what a death metal frontman could be in his 50s, showing the next generation that passion and fury don't weaken with age. That night in 2018, people felt something shift. It wasn't nostalgia, it was renewal. Tomas Lindberg was proving that At the Gates still had the strength to raise the bar for everyone else. When At the Gates reunited, the shadow of their legendary 1995 album, Slaughter of the Soul, loomed large. Fans wondered, could they live up to their own myth? For Tomas Lindberg, the pressure was heavier than anyone else's. He wasn't just expected to sing, he was expected to embody a legacy. Yet in 2018, when he grabbed the microphone, he didn't sound trapped by the past. Instead, his voice roared like he had carried the old scars proudly and turned them into fuel. Every scream carried 20 years of history, and every lyric reminded the crowd why At the Gates were worshipped as pioneers of melodic death metal. This wasn't a man trying to relive his youth. It was an artist who had learned how to control his fury and deliver it with precision. The band behind him was tighter than ever, but it was Lindberg's presence that tied everything together. With one performance, he reminded everyone that gens don't fade, they evolve. And in that moment, he wasn't just honoring history. He was making new history, setting a new standard for what it means to be timeless in metal. By 2018, many metal vocalists from the early 90s had either stepped away or lost their edge. But Tomas Lindberg stood as proof that fire, once lit, doesn't have to burn out. His performance showed discipline, rage, and conviction, all rolled into one. Each song he delivered wasn't just played, it was attacked, like a battle cry against complacency. The band's newer material, especially songs from To Drink from the Night itself, carried that signature At the Gates sound, but also something sharper, something darker. And Lindberg's delivery made it clear that this was no reunion gimmick. This was survival. Fans could see it in his eyes. He was there not just to entertain, but to conquer. And in doing so, he reminded everyone that At the Gates weren't a relic of the past. They were still leaders, still inventors, still capable of raising the bar for metal around the world. The fire wasn't just still burning, it was spreading. Tomas Lindberg has never been the kind of frontman who needs gimmicks. He doesn't rely on costumes, props, or theatrics. His weapon is presence. In 2018, he stood on stage with his trademark stance, microphone in hand, eyes locked on the crowd, and that was enough to command thousands. His every movement was deliberate, every shout perfectly timed. The audience wasn't just listening, they were being led into battle. There's something about the way Lindberg carries himself, a balance between raw aggression and total control. You feel like he could lose himself in the chaos, but he never does. Instead, he pulls the chaos into his hands and directs it. This ability separates him from other vocalists. In 2018, he showed that true leadership on stage doesn't mean towering over the band, it means becoming one with it. Fans weren't just cheering for him, they were following him, and in doing so, they felt like they were part of something bigger than a concert. They were part of a movement that At the Gates had sparked decades ago and were still pushing forward. When At the Gates released To Drink from the Night itself in 2018, fans held their breath. Could it measure up to their classics? On stage, the answer became clear. The new songs weren't just good, they were alive. Tomas Lindberg gave them teeth. Tracks like the title song carried a darker, more desperate energy, and Lindberg poured his entire being into the lyrics. His voice wasn't just screaming words, it was telling stories of despair, resistance, and survival. Fans who came for nostalgia quickly realized the new material stood shoulder to shoulder with the old. The way Lindberg delivered those songs made them instantly unforgettable. He gave them the same urgency he once gave Blinded by Fear, and that made them timeless from the first performance. The audience wasn't just hearing a new album, they were witnessing it to take flight. And in that moment, At the Gates proved that their creativity hadn't run dry. They were still capable of shaking the ground beneath the metal world. Metal shows are known for wild crowds, but the energy in 2018 was different. It wasn't just chaos, it was worship. As Tomas Lindberg shouted into the microphone, the fans screamed every lyric back at him, word for word, old songs and new. The mosh pits were furious, but there was also unity. It felt less like a concert and more like a ritual. Every gesture, every growl, every pause in Lindberg's delivery was met with waves of sound from the audience. He wasn't just performing, he was communicating. Fans knew exactly when to roar back, when to hold their breath, and when to let loose. This connection proved something vital. At the Gates weren't simply performing for their fans, they were performing with them. The crowd didn't just respond, they became part of the performance itself, and Lindberg, always aware, pushed harder, fed by the energy, and gave even more in return. At the Gates' return in 2018 carried a hidden message: metal is not bound by age. Tomas Lindberg was in his mid-40s, yet his intensity matched or even outshined vocalists half his age. He didn't move like a man slowing down, he moved like a man still hungry. His voice hadn't weakened. It had grown stronger, deeper, and more commanding. Watching him that year shattered the myth that extreme music belongs only to the young. Instead, he showed that wisdom and experience can make a frontman even more dangerous. His lyrics carried more weight, his delivery more purpose. He wasn't screaming blindly, he was screaming with vision. Lindberg proved that metal doesn't have to fade as its creators grow older. It can mature, expand, and hit even harder. By 2018, he had become not just a performer, but a living example of what longevity in metal looks like. Though Tomas Lindberg is often the focus, At the Gates is more than one man. In 2018, the chemistry between the band members was undeniable. Guitar riffs carved the air, drums thundered like war machines, and Lindberg tied it all together. But what fans saw wasn't just a group of musicians playing songs, it was a brotherhood. Years apart, lineup changes and personal struggles had not broken them. Instead, they had rebuilt themselves into something stronger. Lindberg's voice was the weapon, but the band behind him was the armor. Together they reminded fans why At the Gates had inspired countless bands after them. On stage, they weren't simply playing music, they were standing as proof that unity can withstand time and turmoil. And in that unity, Tomas Lindberg shone brighter, supported by the power of those around him. For years, At the Gates' legacy rested on a single masterpiece: Slaughter of the Soul. But in 2018, Tomas Lindberg and the band reclaimed their story. They showed that their history was not frozen in 1995. They were still here, still pushing, still capable of making new statements. Lindberg, as the voice of that legacy, carried the weight with pride, but without fear. His performance made it clear that they were not content to be remembered for one album. They were writing a second chapter of their career, one just as important as the first. The fans didn't just witness a band returning, they witnessed a band redefining themselves. And Lindberg was at the center of it, fierce and unrelenting, making sure the world knew that At the Gates were not just survivors, they were leaders once again. By the end of 2018, it was undeniable. Tomas Lindberg had set a new standard for metal frontmen. He had shown that fury can evolve, that age can strengthen rather than weaken, and that legacy is not a cage, but a foundation. His voice, once the sound of a rising genre, had become the voice of its endurance. Every scream, every lyric, every moment on stage proved that At the Gates were not relics. They were the future. The bar had been raised not only for death metal, but for all of heavy music. Lindberg had shown that passion never dies, and when harnessed, it becomes something even greater. For fans, his performance in 2018 was not just a concert. It was a declaration: metal still has giants, and Tomas Lindberg is one of them.